Hey, hello everyone. This is Ben Norton. This is Moderate Rebels Live. I always try to start on time and I'm almost always on time, but Max, my co-host Max Blumenthal is often running late and usually he doesn't have a good excuse, but today he actually does have a pretty good excuse. He got locked out of his house. So he'll be joining us in a few minutes, but I didn't want to start even later than we already started. And today we're going to talk about a story you've probably seen all over mainstream corporate media, which is just really ridiculous. This idea of Havana syndrome, which really, honestly, I think at this point it's just totally fabricated. There's absolutely no evidence of it whatsoever. There's no scientific basis. The only so called evidence of Havana syndrome that was presented, again, evidence in scare quotes, by the US government ended up being crickets. It was a recording that the US government claimed was some kind of sonic attack, and it actually ended up being crickets. And there are scientists, leading scientists who are experts, who have said that, if anything, this is likely an example of mass psychosis. It's totally a psychotic break with that these CIA agents are having and these State Department officials. So when Max gets here, we'll talk more about that. But I'll begin this stream today while I'm waiting on Max, looking at a story in a media outlet that usually I wouldn't trust much because they have done their share of echoing the US State Department, of pushing Russiagate, of supporting every single war dutifully. I'm talking about BuzzFeed, the media outlet that got its start doing listicles about what the best makeup is and vacation resorts and Harry Potter character. And now they have a pretty substantial reporting arm, and the so-called reporting they do usually happens to dovetail with the US State Department. I mentioned that BuzzFeed was indispensable in pushing a lot of Russiagate hysteria and propaganda. So I'm not. This is not in any way to defend BuzzFeed, but they do have a report that they just published today, September 30th, titled "A Declassified State Department Report Says Microwaves Didn't Cause So-Called Havana Syndrome." I'm glad they put that in quotes because this, I mean, it's so obviously a fraudulent, ridiculous scare. But let's look at this article really quickly. Noises linked to mysterious injuries among U.S. diplomats in Cuba were most likely caused by crickets, not microwave weapons, according to declassified scientific review commissioned by the U.S. State Department and exclusively obtained by BuzzFeed. So I was acknowledging this earlier. This actually has been known for a while. The U.S. government presented this so-called evidence in scare quotes, claiming that it was an example of microwave weapons. And multiple scientists said when it was released that actually it was not weapons, it was actually crickets. And now we have further conclusive evidence that it was crickets because internally, a scientific review commissioned by the U.S. State Department itself acknowledged that these were crickets. It notes that the State Department report was written by an advisory group called JASON, which is an elite scientific board that has reviewed U.S. national security concerns since the Cold War. This was completed in November 2018. So, again, this has been known for years now. This isn't necessarily news, but it's further confirmation from the U.S. State Department itself. It was obtained by BuzzFeed via a FOIA request, it's Freedom of Information Act, and it was a secret document. So it concluded that they were most likely caused by insects, the sounds accompanying this. And it says the scientific review also judged it highly unlikely that microwaves or ultrasound beams were involved in the incidents. So it notes that now, 2 years later, there are so many media reports, which are just based on what the CIA says, claiming that these so-called attacks are likely the result of microwaves or ultrasound beams. But that's absolutely not. In fact, this report commissioned by the U.S. State Department, in fact, it didn't conclusively conclude. It found that psychogenic mass psychology effects may have played a role. So again, this is directly from the mouth of the U.S. government. Psychogenic mass psychology. So it's a bunch of CIA spooks who are all just thinking that they're being attacked by some Russian or Cuban or Vietnamese or Chinese ray gun. And they because they think it, they all feel like they're sick. Because look at what the symptoms are: vertigo and difficulty concentrating. So they can't focus, they feel dizzy, and they have a headache. Those are the so-called symptoms of Havana syndrome. Havana syndrome. No plausible single energy source, neither radio nor microwave nor sonic, can produce both the recorded audio video signals and the reported medical effects, reported the scientific report from the U.S. State Department. We believe the recorded sounds are mechanical or biological rather than electronic. The most likely source is the Indies short-tailed cricket. So again, this whole media fabricated scandal that is all over has been totally pushed by the CIA. And in fact, recently in Congress, they voted in a unanimous vote to give more medical attention to these spooks in the CIA who are all collectively going crazy and think that they're being attacked by Russian ray guns, even though there's no scientific evidence for it whatsoever. So Max has it looks like Max has been able to break into his own house and join us for the live stream. How you doing, Max? I can't hear you. I don't know if that's just me. Can people hear him?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear him. Yeah, there you
go. Good. Yeah, I luckily left a little window open in my otherwise fortified bunker, and I'm in. Yeah, it was an adventure. Broke a few things on the way, but anything to get to the Moderate Rebels crew, to get these chats really light up my life. So yeah, what are we? It sounds like we're on Havana syndrome and mass hysteria.
Yeah, absolutely. I began talking just about the latest report in BuzzFeed. I made it clear I wasn't endorsing BuzzFeed with all their Russiagate propaganda, but looking at this internal State Department document acknowledging that there's absolutely no evidence of any kind of sound attacks or sonic waves or radio weapon, and rather that the sound they presented was actually crickets, and that it's likely an example of mass psychosis. This has been known for a while. This is from 2019. Here's a physics website, phys.org. So again, this isn't necessarily new, but this is the first time that we have a breaking report from inside the U.S. State Department acknowledging that there's no evidence for this. It's pretty incredible. And I got to say, it would be so hilarious if this all began because a CIA agent was making an excuse for why he didn't want to do work or show up or something, or file his report, and he just said that he felt bad. And then a bunch of other CIA agents also, they were like, yeah, we can just tell all our bosses that we feel bad and we were attacked by some kind of Russian ray gun, and now we don't have to file our reports or whatever. And it just, I mean, it's continued to scale and blow out of proportions. But although I do want to stress this, the U.S. Congress just voted unanimously to provide additional health services to CIA spooks and coup plotters supposedly suffering from Havana syndrome. And I want to point out that they said that this might affect around 200 people. So this fake mass psychological hysteria that we're seeing among CIA agents, even the U.S. government acknowledges that we're talking about 200 people. So the U.S. government can't give healthcare to its own citizens, but it can give extra unneeded healthcare in addition to the benefits it already gives to the coup plotters at the CIA for the imaginary headaches that they feel.
Well, this is not the first time we learned about these crickets. I mean, it was reported, I think 2 years ago, that mating crickets were the source of the so-called the supposed headaches that U.S. diplomats, I mean, it wasn't just CIA agents, it was diplomats in Havana were experiencing. And this does appear to be a case of mass psychosis. But my question is, when we started to see people in Washington, Biden administration staffers claiming they were suffering from Havana syndrome, to what extent was this psychosis deliberately cultivated by intelligence services among even civilian staffers? In other words, to what extent were they being coached You wake up with a bad headache. It happens all the time. It happens to me. Everyone, maybe you have a cold, but you're hearing about this syndrome. And, in the background, there is a deluge of news reports about Russiagate, about Russian meddling, about Russians hiding under our beds, Russians attacking, maybe shutting down our heating supply in the winter. Rachel Maddow warned of that. And you start to wonder if Russians are actually tailing you, and then a US intelligence officer shows up at your door or calls you in and says, or one of your superiors, maybe you're a desk jockey at the CIA, or you're a diplomat, and then the tough, field officer who works out of the US embassy calls you in and says, I think this is, something the Russians are doing. We've been studying these microwave attacks for some years, and I think that's what you may be suffering from. And then you become a victim of war. You basically get a Purple Heart, and you get to say that you were attacked by the Russians or the Cubans or some other official enemy. You get off from work. You maybe get benefits. And, me and Ben also talked about how, dissidents are coached and implanted with a false consciousness in order to lie about the official enemy state they come from. We talked about that on my Rockfin live stream. So I wonder how much U.S. officials, meaning anyone who works for the government, particularly abroad, they're being coached. There should be an investigation here by the Inspector General into how this mass hysteria reached such a fever pitch. If the U.S. government actually cares, if there are elements in the U.S. government that actually care about diplomacy, then they should be concerned that so many officials in the Foreign Service and the intelligence services are concocting these stories and making relations even worse with states the U.S. considers hostile, but which it also deals with. I mean, normalization with Cuba has been on the table since the Obama administration. So now this is a key source of friction. So I think there really needs to be an independent investigation and accountability for these liars.
Well said. Well said. I also want to point out that you mentioned that we've known this for 2 years, that the so-called evidence that the U.S. government provided, this recording, was actually just crickets. Here's thescientist.com back in 2019. But I want to point out that there have been some medical experts for years now, leading experts, pointing out that there's absolutely no evidence of this. And there was a book published. This is a scholarly academic book. In fact, Max and I are going to try to get one of these scientists to come on our show to talk about their scientific findings. This is a book called Havana Syndrome, Mass Psychogenic Illness, and the Real Story Behind the Embassy Mystery and Hysteria. This was published in 2020, a year ago. It solves a medical mystery that has confounded the US and Canadian governments and the global medical community, provides an intriguing example of mass psychogenic illness. So these are two leading experts. One is Robert Bartholomew, teaches in New Zealand, and Robert Ballot, he teaches in California. So we're going to try to get one of them to come on, maybe even both, to talk about their book and their scientific work debunking this myth of Havana syndrome. Here's a scientific article they published. I just want to read a little bit of it. This is in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. It's royal, so it's like really official. Challenging the diagnosis of Havana syndrome as a novel clinical entity. This is from October 2019, nearly a year ago. So this has been known for nearly 2 years ago. So it has been said that history does not repeat itself, but often rhymes. Manifestations of mass psychogenic illness throughout history are notoriously protean, changing with the times to reflect shifting fears and beliefs. Talking about different things. During the 19th century, there was an upsurge in outbreaks in Western schools and factories, coinciding with rigid academic and capitalist discipline, paralleling the rise in scientific rationalism. Prior to this time, episodes were typified by anxiety associated with fears of witches and demons. So, trance-like states, abnormal movements, and neurological symptoms began to manifest in industrial settings with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and harsh work conditions, etc. I mean, there's all kinds of things. Fears of contamination in the environmental movement, people thinking that Wi-Fi is going to kill you and give you cancer. So there's been many examples of this, but they took it a step further and pointed out that given all these historical examples, it's very likely that this so-called Havana syndrome is actually just it's just some kind of psychosocial event. And again, these are major scientists. So we're going to try to get them on. I think it's a really revealing incident because it's just so politically convenient to the CIA, to the US government. Who are the culprits? The culprits allegedly are Cuba. It was also reported in Vietnam. Of course, Russia has been blamed. So the
Does
US
it ever get
can use it.
reported in like, does it ever get reported in like uh Luxembourg or one of, a state that's just not really on the target board? I mean, it's kind of convenient how it keeps happening in these places.
Well, yeah, no, exactly. And the funny thing is, you have these people. You have I think there's two elements of it. One, there are these coup plotters and spies and diplomats, so-called diplomats, who they have every reason to feel paranoid because they're plotting so many undemocratic things to destabilize many of these countries like Cuba and Russia and Vietnam. So they have a lot of reasons to feel that they might be attacked or targeted, even though they're not being. That's very likely not being targeted or attacked. So they think that because they're doing all these bad things that they've become victims. But then I also think that there's the element, like you said, that these people believe that the Russians and Cubans and Vietnamese are so nefarious and just want to attack and kill Americans and make them suffer and give them a headache with a headache gun or something. So it's so hilarious, but it's an example of that
How come
American
they never
paranoia.
how come they never blame them for like a diarrhea gun? Like most gringos always get diarrhea in places like Cuba or Vietnam or whatever, but they never say that. They come up with a very exotic illness. I guess it has to be exotic for it to kind of resonate with the US public. But
Well,
it
and it's
just
so perfect because it's the physical embodiment of the like the obsession with being a martyr. America, like the U.S., always wants to be a martyr. Like RussiaGate was supposedly it was the new Pearl Harbor. We were attacked
Yeah, do you remember
supposedly.
there were hacking Russiagate hacking survivors, and I remember this one woman who worked for the DNC was really upset because she saw an RT billboard that was kind of mocking Americans about their freak out over Russian hacking, and she said, "How dare they place this on the homeland, on our soil? I am a hacking survivor." So everyone has this survivor they want to have this survivor syndrome, like they went abroad and they fought for our country and they served and they were attacked. It's kind of Tom Clancy-esque.
Well, and it feeds into like this new kind of liberal Gen Z millennial culture where
Yeah,
everyone has
trauma.
to Yeah, where everyone has to always constantly air their trauma, and everyone always talks about how they have mental illness, and the internet just slowly drives them crazy. So then they talk about how crazy they are on the internet, which just furthers the cycle. And all these diplomats are just going through the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, and many of them reflect that culture and its sensibility. They come from that East Coast culture of highly educated people, very individualized, who are narcissistic and caught up in their own emotions and trauma and encouraged to do so just by the general culture. I want to play a clip. I sent it to you, or I can throw it on.
Yeah, I'll get up.
We were just in New York. We'll play it in a second. I was just in New York with Anya Parampil, close collaborator. Many of you have heard of her, and she interviewed Carlos de Cosio, who is the essentially the top Cuban diplomat in charge of foreign relations with the United States. He's based in New York. We went to the Cuban mission in New York. She interviewed him. The interview's up at the Gray Zone, and she asked him about Havana syndrome. So we're going to play his response. The Cuban government has investigated it thoroughly, and their response is really interesting. So this report in BuzzFeed isn't surprising at all, except that it actually saw the light of day a day after the Washington Post, the Bezos Post, the CIA Post, as Ben would probably accurately call it, called for more answers. So, I mean, there are clearly competing interests within the permanent bureaucracy in the State Department and intelligence services here. But I just think there's a larger point to be made before we watch this clip that Ben touched on, which is just something about our culture and about our media culture. I mean, the concept of psychogenic mass psychology effects can explain so many of the official freakouts that we have been subjected to, especially since Donald Trump was elected, that have been inserted into the public consciousness and particularly into the liberal and middle class coastal consciousness in order to induce obedience and acquiescence to an official agenda. And of course, there was Russiagate, which, I mean, it's so amazing how as soon as Donald Trump goes away, the Russiagate freakout dies, and Donald Trump's ambassador to Moscow can be kept on by Joe Biden. Joe Biden can authorize the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and everyone in the media decides not to care. The media is clearly an arm of this permanent bureaucracy, what Trump called the deep state, and its job is to impose or induce these cascading episodes of psychogenic mass psychology or mass formation of the public that got the we looked at the opinion polls, the Pew polls, Chicago Public Affairs polls on Americans' opinions of Russia from prior to Trump and after Trump, and they declined precipitously, along with their view of China, which was positive overall before Donald Trump's election. So a new Cold War was triggered. Then you have January 6th, another induced freak out in order to kind of set the stage for the Biden era, where it embarks on a project of mass securitization and surveillance of the populist far right, which it considers a huge threat to its agenda. And like any right-wing organizer today will tell you, grassroots right-wing organizer will probably tell you they've been visited by FBI agents, but it's also about just inducing this fear that they're going to come back. And living in DC, I saw these gigantic walls go up all around my city. Troops come to my city, 40 to 50,000 for nothing. The so-called insurrectionists, who were really just a bunch of clowns and rioters who left by 6 p.m. after a little tear gas entered the air. These people were not coming back, and we were told there will be QAnon insider attacks at Biden's inauguration. We need to be kept in this constant state of mass psychosis in order to maintain support for a cracking centrist consensus. And, you know, I'm not allowed to really talk about it on YouTube, but I think this applies very well to the new normal that we're in, the biomedical situation. And I'll just kind of leave it there. I think we should watch what Carlos de Cosio has to say in response to Anya's question about Havana syndrome and what this is the official Cuban response.
Yeah, so here is the clip from Anya's interview, which is up at the Gray Zone.
FBI made an investigation and concluded that there was no proof of any wrongdoing by anyone. We made our own investigation and coincided it came to the same conclusion. We put perhaps the best team of experts that we have in Cuba in multiple disciplines to study, and they have defeated each and every one of the different theories I've come on. The one about sonic attack, similar to a cicadas. Yeah. They have defeated the ones about microwave, believing that you can send a microwave through a wall where there are 5 people, target one and not the rest, for a microwave energy to cause the kind of impact in the brain and in the ear that is being alleged. There would have to be at least burning scars in the person involved. Practically, the head will go on fire. So a person cannot say that suddenly began to feel dizzy, that they had headaches, all of which is possible to have occurred, as a result that at some moment in which they couldn't find out which one it was, there was a strange sound and they received an ultrasound. Now, I'm not saying that the people who have the symptoms are portraying this, but the scientists that have spoken about this have been challenged in multiple occasions by authorized scientists in the US, in Europe, and in Cuba, and in scientific magazines. The US government has not given officially credit to any of these theories, but they have not rejected them either. We believe the US government is some sort of trap. At this moment, we don't know how they can come out of it, but I can assure you that no diplomat from any country has ever had any reason to feel threatened in Cuba. I can give you guarantee of that, and I am sure that the majority of U.S. diplomats that have served in Cuba since 1977 have never felt reason to believe that they can be threatened in Cuba more than they can be threatened in any other part of the world, including many parts of the United States.
Yeah, so that's the clip from the interview that Anya did. It's up at the Gray Zone. And I want to point out really quickly from the mouth of the DC foreign policy establishment. This is foreign policy. You can see they published an article, claims of microwave attacks are scientifically implausible. I have it up in archive because this is, by the way, a tip out there to everyone. If you want to get past paywalls, just use archive.today. My favorite little tip. But so this is an article that they published back in May. And again, this is foreign policy, one of the main mouthpieces of the foreign policy orthodoxy in Washington. There's little evidence for the so-called weapon behind Havana syndrome. And it says here, aside from the reported syndromes, there's no evidence that such a microwave weapon exists. And all of the available science suggests that any such weapon would be wildly impractical. It's possible that the symptoms of all the sufferers of Havana syndrome share a single as yet unknown cause. Yeah, it's psychosocial. It's also possible that multiple real health problems have been amalgamated into a single syndrome, so that there are multiple people with migraines and other health issues, and then they're all kind of lumping it together. I mean, there are a lot of people who work for the State Department and for U.S. spy agencies, tens of thousands. So 200 out of tens of thousands is not that many, honestly. I just want to point out this article begins with a quote from Trump's last acting Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller, who called Havana syndrome a, quote, act of war. It's an act of war that the CIA is waging on itself by being insane, by hiring a bunch of mentally ill people. I mean, how much more hysterical could it get than people claiming that this is an act of war, even though there's absolutely no scientific evidence for it? It's pretty incredible.
And it's incredible how often we hear that phrase nowadays. I don't actually recall hearing that phrase until Trump was elected and we heard about Russian hacking being an act of war. Hillary Clinton likened it to 9/11. Eric Swalwell likened it to a new Pearl Harbor. We constantly heard everything Russia was doing was an act of war. Okay, well, then do something. What are you going to do? Then the U.S. doesn't do anything. So it's all bluster.
Well, it's kind of like genocide. I mean, the term genocide is becoming so weakened too, so watered down that the U.S. accuses China of genocide for political points, and then that actually waters down real cases and real attacks. And for me, I mean, I agree with you that since Trump was elected, that there has been this major increase in this like hysterical mentality. I hate to use that term because, people might criticize me and say it's sexist or gendered, but I mean, men are just as hysterical in this case. Like the men, like most of the people who claim to be Havana syndrome victims are men. They're CIA spooks who,
they really need to man up.
Yeah, but I mean, it really is a kind of hysteria. I think that's the best term to describe it. But I agree with you that it's kind of new with Trump, but I think you have to go back to 9/11. And a lot of this is an extension of the war on terror. And I remember distinctively the kind of hysteria and the idea that terrorists, that Al-Qaeda is going to like blow up a school bus in Utah or something.
Yep.
The idea that you have to, it's like duck and cover, right? I mean, it's so ridiculous. I think there's an element of truth in what you said about like the time we're living through now. But the difference is now is that hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. have died, and millions of people around the world have died. Whereas I think with the war on terror, it was so patently ridiculous because how many people in the U.S. have died of so-called terrorism, quote unquote, since 9/11? I mean,
well, terrorism was more of a threat to people in the Middle East, but
exactly,
not to get into the death toll of what we've seen in the past 2 years. I don't know what I'm even allowed to talk about anymore.
Exactly.
I believe in all of these cases, if death tolls are not inflated, through statistical manipulation that the deaths are real. And in all cases, when we talk about, for example, the R2P style of propaganda, there has to be deaths and there has to be atrocities. We never denied, my computer is doing something. We never denied that, civilians were dying in Syria, that they were dying under that, the Syrian government's Vietnam era weapons were killing some number of civilians, that civilians were suffering massively. I mean, I went through East Ghouta and Duma and those areas and saw the destruction. Obviously, there were armed groups in there that were causing enormous amounts of destruction, literally holding people slaves, terrorizing minority groups. I mean, we've seen the video of the Jaish al-Islam Saudi-backed militia in Ghouta carrying Alawite women in cages to use them as human shields against Russian bombing. But there couldn't be this kind of CNN effect without some atrocities. Same with Serbia, Yugoslavia, the same with Libya, although it was on a much smaller scale. So there's always death, but it's the way that the US media, the corporate media, working hand in glove with the permanent national security bureaucracy, conveys it to the US public, where you don't see the US-backed, CIA-backed so-called rebels killing people, but you zoom in on children and it becomes so manipulative. And then they start to develop children who can speak English and speak directly to you in order to call for us to do something. And the whole point is to shut off your critical faculties, whether it's in the new normal, Russiagate, or any situation. There's always a way to handle these situations rationally. And these are situations, well, Syria could have easily been handled by not arming the so-called moderate rebels back in 2012, 2013. It would have ended the whole thing, and then have a diplomatic solution that doesn't depend on regime change. There could have been massive political reform. And right now, there could be a much more sane solution than, I don't know, shutting down Harvard Business School completely because there's cases. But that's not the way that we're going to go as a society. We always have to do something, and it's always a military war-like interventionist solution. And that's what I think the Havana Syndrome origins are, is just to create another crisis, keep it going as long as possible, and then demand to do something. The problem with this scenario here, unlike Syria, for example, where they managed to find a lot of sympathetic victims, or the health situation now in the US where just common people are suffering, is that the victims here are not very sympathetic characters. I mean, we're talking about spooks, and whether, people think they're heroes or not, they're not necessarily the most relatable people, and, they're not children.
Yeah. On this note, before we pivot away and start talking about some other things, I just want to talk about a few other points. This is so funny. So here's NBC's report on the Havana Syndrome bill passing in the House. It passed unanimously. I'll get back to that point in a second. But here, this is their article. For me, it says so much about the Biden era. This is so funny. It says, the Helping American Victims Afflicted by Neurological Attacks Act, or Havana Act, is one of the most significant pieces of legislation passed to date. Which for me, I mean, that's the perfect symbol of the Biden administration. So the Biden administration has Democratic control of both chambers in Congress. I mean, it's very slim, but really the only piece of legislation they've managed to pass is legislation to give CIA, Pentagon, and State Department spooks extra medical attention for an imaginary disease because they're all collectively going crazy. And here, this is again from NBC, but it's really from the U.S. government, because NBC is a mouthpiece for the U.S. government. At least 200 Americans have come forward to describe possible cases.
Possible. It's always possible.
And again,
let's pass
legislation
about possible stuff.
Like 320 million Americans. Well, not that many, but tens of millions of Americans don't have access to healthcare. Tens of millions. And of the Americans who have so-called access to healthcare, they actually have access to health insurance, which is not healthcare, which is you still have to pay tons of money often, and it doesn't include a lot of services, a lot of necessary medical attention that should be provided by universal, Medicare for all or some other program. But meanwhile, 200 Americans are suffering from this imaginary, I'm just going to say it's imaginary disease. And who are they? 60 involve the military or their relatives, 50 are tied to the State Department, and roughly half are CIA officers or their relatives. So they're all in the national security state. Half CIA, 1/4 Pentagon, and 1/4 State Department. These are the people we're talking about. And the U.S. can't, the Congress, the fact that it's controlled, both branches are controlled by the Democratic Party, and they still can't pass anything. And meanwhile, look at this vote. I just wanted to get this up. It says everything. So this is from the U.S. House clerk. Roll call on the bill, Havana bill. This is September 21st. 427 votes yes, 0 votes no. 0 votes present. I mean, it's not even like, AOC, it was this big scandal because AOC voted present on giving more military assistance to apartheid Israel. They didn't even bother to vote present for medical attention for this imaginary illness for CIA agents. 100% yes. I mean, to me, it's the perfect symbol of the Biden administration. This is the only thing they're going to pass.
Well, yeah. And there's been many attempts to make the CIA seem sympathetic, which shows you there's a CIA hand in the media coverage. I remember right after 9/11, there was this guy, Johnny Michael Spann, who was the first U.S. casualty of the so-called war on terror. And he was a CIA agent who was actually in an Afghan prison conducting torture on detainees with, I think, like the Northern Alliance, Ahmed Shah Massoud's gang of, CIA proxies. He was like the least sympathetic character possible. He was just a torture agent. We'll get into that when we talk about Assange. But then at the dawn of Russiagate, they had the CIA wall. And I remember Kurt Eichenwald would always go on CNN and whatever. Democracy Now! Was hosting him at the time. And he'd always talk about the wall of those fallen heroes. And I look at that wall and I think that these people are under attack. And, Kurt Eichenwald, this guy who couldn't punch his way out of a wet paper bag, who just has this weird tentacle porn fetish. He's just obviously bonkers. He was hiding behind the CIA to make himself seem like this tough warrior. And they were obviously pulling his strings along with the whole narrative of Russiagate. And they made themselves into this kind of, at least among liberals who had their brains hacked by MSNBC. It's done so much damage to the boomer generation, to like the educated boomers who used to like, maybe they dodged the draft. It was like the one thing they ever did to resist the government. But today they've become lovers, just deeply in love with the CIA and the FBI, thanks to Russiagate. And so I think the CIA was just trying to build on it here. And they got some extra bonuses. I mean, it's pretty impressive. But someone pointed out that we should bring these crickets to Washington, if we can have like an import program, drop some in Langley. I don't know. Just put them in the woods around Langley and see what happens. Like, why aren't they here?
So people have been joking about this, but it would be so hilarious if all of this just ended up being CIA agents having hangovers. And there's actually some evidence suggesting this. So this is from friend of the show, Jan Buchner, great Canadian writer and podcaster, and musician. So he pointed out that the Washington Post just published this op-ed you mentioned, the Bezos Post. The source of the Havana syndrome must be found, saying it's a national security threat. And here's this guy, Mark Polymeropoulos, which sounds like a fake Greek name to make fun of Greek people, like a Polymeropoulos.
I wonder what Kyriakou would have to say about him.
But so he's a former CIA agent. He says, "Thank you to the Washington Post editorial board on behalf of all of the victims for this important piece." Of course, it's not disclosed in this piece by the editorial board that Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, also has $100 million, I think it's $600 million contract with the CIA to do, or maybe it's $60 million, tens of millions of dollars in a contract to do cloud computing with Amazon for the CIA. So, I mean, the owner of the boss of the editorial board of the Washington Post has a direct financial investment in the CIA. But anyway, so this is in their article. This is so hilarious. So Polymeropoulos was in Moscow in 2017, the CIA agent. It says they met with the U.S. ambassador, John Huntsman, and other embassy staffers. They were supposedly followed by FSB tails. That's what they claim. I mean, obviously, this is all just what the CIA tells them. But it didn't stop the CIA agent and his colleagues from seeing the sights. A local McDonald's, the fabled Moscow Metro, and here's the money quote, and dive bars where Russian patrons earnestly asked them why the Americans hated Russia so much. So they were drinking with Russians. Put a pin in that. And here it says, Polymeropoulos awoke with a start. The feeling of nausea was overwhelming. Food poisoning, he thought, and he went for the bathroom. And when he tried to get out of bed, he fell over. He tried to stand up and fell again. It was the early morning hours of December 2017, and his Moscow hotel room was spinning around him. His ears were ringing. He recalled, like I was going to both throw up and pass out at the same time. Look, I'm not a big drinker, but all of those symptoms he's describing, I have felt those symptoms before as well. I think it's called being hungover, dude.
Ben is definitely not a big drinker I can confirm that.
Yeah. So honestly, we actually now have evidence that the first ever case of so-called Havana syndrome is a CIA agent who the night before was drinking with Russians. And as Dan Buckner points out, who has spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, it's very dangerous to go drinking with Russians. And he jokes, I've had Havana syndrome in Belgrade, Beijing, Helsinki, Odessa, Calgary. So Belfast has an incredibly high concentration of directed energy weapons. So, I mean, there is a non-zero, very real possibility that all of this began because a CIA agent drank with some Russians. He got really drunk. He was hungover the next day, and he was paranoid and thought that the Russians hit him with some ray guns.
Yeah, I remember we were in La Paz in Bolivia, and it was like the first night we got there, and we had pisco sours, and you didn't even finish one, and I finished it for you, I think, and I had like two more.
Well, to be fair, that's because it was kind of nasty. What was that? I love Bolivia, but what's that Bolivian whiskey? It's really not good.
Pisco, and it's got whipped egg in it, and I stumbled outside and I started feeling my head spinning, and I had this pounding headache, and I crumpled on the ground under an attack from Fidel Castro's drone. No, it was just the elevation. But it was something I'd never felt before, where you just drink a little bit of alcohol and you're not used to the elevation being something like 3 miles high. And you feel like you're under attack. It took me, a good hour to fully recover. And then, your blood gradually adjusts to the low oxygen levels. But these are, the field officers like Polymeropoulos, they're traveling a lot. They're heavy drinkers. He's 50 years old. They're going through time zones. Who knows what they're taking on the plane, what kind of sleeping drugs they're taking or whatever. But I was just reading while you were reading that summary, I was reading another article about him by NPR, and it really plays up the strong possibility that he was attacked by some microwave weapon in Moscow, but constantly they come back to him commenting that he has no evidence, that the CIA has no evidence, and he's demanding to be treated at Walter Reed and to get all this preferential treatment. When you think about the whole culture of the CIA and these former agents during the Russiagate era, they've all become media stars. They've all gotten to become media stars. And so this is his way of injecting himself in the media, making himself a player now that he's retired. And then when you become a media star, what do you get? Like Phil Mudd, who he had this fantasy of being the CIA director, and he never rose that far. James Clapper, John Brennan, you get really lucrative contributor deals with the networks, or you get to be like John Cipher. He's always called on by different outlets as the expert, and he becomes kind of a public figure. For some reason, the Intercepted podcast even had him on as if he's credible, and he claimed to be some Russian bureau chief, but I think they inflate their roles. at the agency, but this is all about self-promotion in addition to getting these bills passed. And it just deserves to be mocked. It deserves to be mocked so hard.
Here's friend of the show, Paul Sliker. Thanks, Paul. Havana syndrome sounds fun, aka partying. I mean,
yeah. I mean, what I actually had someone DM me the other day because I made a joke about Havana syndrome, and they claimed that they had it, and I had to interview them. I'd never heard of them before. They claim they're just a common citizen, and that it's more common than we realize. It's also like big pharma invents viruses or diseases. Like, you may have restless leg syndrome.
yeah.
What the hell? Like, yeah, I feel kind of like if I sit there too long, my legs get restless. Or Paxil, that was a huge scandal. I think it was not Pfizer. It might have been Eli Lilly, one of the major 5 companies that's responsible for what we know of as big pharma and basically our country's entire biomedical policy. They created the concept of social anxiety disorder, which makes up the acronym SAD, S-A, and then they said, you may have this because many people feel anxious around large crowds. And, there is such a thing as social anxiety. So they gave them this drug, and the drug caused people to feel initially better. It amps up your serotonin levels. So it basically gets you high, as opiates do. But then when people started to reduce their dosages or went off the drug, they became suicidal. They fell into complete physical and psychological catastrophe. One person actually shot themselves in the face and survived. And there were these really ugly congressional hearings in 2004 where the survivors of Paxil testified. Chantix by Pfizer, I don't know if you've seen the Ray Liotta ads. This was a drug to supposedly help you quit smoking, and this drug was just taken off the market because of the risk of cancer from taking it. It's supposed to prevent cancer. So, I mean, there's so many different toxic cultural phenomena that you can extrapolate out of the Havana syndrome. And so many of these spooks are just reflective of our broader culture and everything that's wrong with it.
It's also just so funny because anyone who knows even like the most elementary history of the CIA knows that it's always been funded and run by alcoholics. Like that has been one of the alcoholic wasps, right? Like
big time.
That has been the main hallmark. So the idea that all these CIA agents have headaches. Look, this is the NPR article I think you were referencing. A CIA officer visits Moscow, returns with mysterious crippling headaches. Like there could be so many things. And this gets into another thing that is very unique among Americans. And that's like hypochondria. Like everyone, like at least a lot of my family members, there's so many people who think that they're always sick. They always have something. And it's gotten much worse now with like WebMD and like,
do not Google any, if you feel anything, just don't Google it. Cause you're going to.
And what this reminds me of is now like, there's this new, I mean, you're talking about like over diagnosing things so all of these big pharma companies can get people addicted to drugs and pills they don't need. And, the classic deadly example of that is obviously what we saw with the epidemic of opioids. I mean, tens of thousands, really hundreds of thousands of people dying from this because it were so overprescribed. But also you see it, you're talking about anxiety. Anxiety is another example, but you also see it now with children being diagnosed with ADD. And it's like all these people, these children, they just won't stay still when they won't sit in their desk. They want to go play and run around. And it's like, yeah, that's called being a child. Like we were all like that. But now the solution to it is, of course, a pill, because you can get these children addicted to what essentially meth, but legal. And then you just have this massive guaranteed revenue stream. But I think you can take that a step further just to US culture at large. And there's so many people who think that they have like these major medical issues and a headache and nausea. And if you work for the government, then you just say it's Havana syndrome. To me, it's like the perfect embodiment of the collective insanity that is the US culture. Like American culture is already insane. And there's all these incentives to make people even crazier. And with the internet, it just drives, in social media and the feedback loop in the mainstream corporate media, there's all these internal incentives that just drive people more and more crazy.
Someone saying RLS. Yeah, I agree totally. Couldn't have said it better. But someone saying RLS or restless leg syndrome is a thing. So, I don't want to make light of something that's a thing, but it just seemed like the big pharma was making it a bigger thing than it was.
Well, it's like gluten intolerance. Gluten intolerance is also a thing, but it's very rare. But it gets amplified and it becomes like this fad. And all of these people, all of these like Harvard educated coastal liberals, all think they have gluten intolerance, but they actually don't. It's an example of social pathology. And Havana syndrome is just the spook equivalent of that.
Well, all the spooks out there should eat less gluten, and also their employer should be abolished, but that's another story.
Yeah. Yeah. There's this guy, Austin Hall, who keeps writing this comment. The CIA should not be allowed to continue. It should be abolished. I agree 1,000,000%. I couldn't agree more. Abolish the CIA.
Well, I mean, so there was a proposal in the early 70s to abolish the CIA by the noted radical left-wing Marxist-Leninist Senator Patrick Moynihan, who was actually one of the early kind of neocon figures, more for his domestic policy views, but he also played a terrible role on East Timor as U.S. ambassador to the UN. But he called for abolishing the CIA because it was essentially revealed as a secret government that was carrying out assassinations around the globe and had a not just a kill list, but a kill quota in Vietnam. I mean, the crimes go on and on and on. And he proposed repackaging it into the State Department, where there could be government oversight, in other words, public oversight and accountability. And here you have the State Department kind of shivving the CIA with this report, this internal report. So I wonder if there is some kind of bureaucratic infighting taking place.
So we're going to take a pause here. Join us in part 2 of this episode, and we will be talking about the exposure of the CIA plot to potentially kidnap or even assassinate WikiLeaks journalist Julian Assange. Max has been reporting on this. He actually broke the story in mid-2020, but it has gotten mainstream coverage. We talk more about the CIA plots, the attempt to blame Russia, and all of that in part 2. See you next time.